On behalf of Great Falls College, Montana State University, we welcome you to today's event, part of our Stop the Stigma Week. I'm pleased to introduce the presenters for today's very important event. Dr. Jordan Fuelia is an associate professor of psychology, director of cognitive and affective science laboratory, and research director of the Center for Advancement of Contemplative Education at Naropa University. His research, supported by funding from Mind and Life Institute and John Templeton Foundation, has been featured in leading scientific journals and books and relies on a range of tools from neuroscientific measures to virtual reality to study topics such as mindfulness and compassion. For more about Jordan, he does have a website, www.jordanquaglia.com. Charlotte Z. Rotterdam, MTS, is the director of Naropa University's Center for the Advancement of Contemplative Education and an instructor in Naropa's Core College, Graduate School of Psychology, and Graduate Religious Studies Department. Charlotte directs Naropa's Compassion Initiative and co-developed and co-teaches Naropa's Mindful Compassion training. She consults with the University of Colorado's Institute for Behavioral Science to integrate compassion practices into their WISE, Resilience in Schools and Educators program. She also has a website, www.skyline.us, as well as www.naropa.edu/CACE. So thank you so much for being here today to share your time and your knowledge with us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Again, I'm Jordan. It's great to be here with you all. It seems like we about half and half on Zoom versus in person. So we're originally going to maybe introduce ourselves and so on, but I think we'll just move past that part because it might be a bit tricky if I can't talk by Zoom. And mostly what we're going to focus on today has to do with clarifying what compassion is. This is a term that we use quite often, right? Compassion, I think, generally to denote kind of a helpful approach to suffering, a beneficial approach to suffering, which isn't inconsistent with our understanding. But through the lenses of science, neuroscience, science, and contemplative traditions, compassion has a more specific meaning. And so we're going to focus on that today. It has more to do with an inner experience. And so in a little bit, I'll get started. We're going to work on this, clarifying this at both a conceptual level, kind of intellectual understanding, and also through some experiential activities, get more familiar with it and clarify it in our inner experience as well. Just wanted to give Charlotte a chance to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. I'm Charlotte. It's really good to be here. I was here in Great Falls in May. We taught an 8-month compassion training through the Great Falls Public School District for teachers, and that was a really amazing experience last year when we were all figuring out how to connect with each other. So got to be here in person right at the end of that, and it's really lovely to be back. So just want to also thank Elfie for the invitation to be here and your beautiful vision of this phenomenal week of Stop the Stigma and all those people putting these events together, and we're really honored to be part of it and to be back here. Okay, so I'll come back in a little bit, but back to you, Jordan.
Thanks. Technology is working okay. It's always the hardest part, I think, here. So the title of this workshop, Resilient Compassion. As I said, we're going to be focused on clarifying what compassion is. That's the primary thing that we're going to be focused on today. through this lens, or these lenses of both science and these contemplative traditions that focus on compassion as something that can be trained, something that we can actually develop and get better at, sort of through clarifying what compassion is, there's this view that we can actually sort of strengthen compassion and make it more effective in our life, so that it sort of contributes to our well-being and the well-being of others more readily. So we're going to do this kind of from two different angles. Compassion is this really interesting thing that it involves an interplay between head and heart, an interplay between our concepts about compassion and our inner experience and the sort of more affect or feeling dimensions. So if we work on it from both of these angles, we clarify it from both of these angles, I think that we can strengthen compassion or clarify compassion in ways that matter for our well-being and those around us as well. By the way, feel free to jump in if there's a question that you have that's sort of pressing at any point. That includes people on Zoom. And then Thomas is going to be fielding questions from Zoom, so feel free to jump in. Otherwise, there'll be some time toward the end for questions that are just more general or broad. Okay. So one of the biggest ways that we focus in our trainings on clarifying what compassion is has to do with this distinction between compassion and empathy. So that's what I'm going to be focused on in this more sort of conceptual introduction today. So we'll answer these questions here. What's the sort of real-time or online difference between empathy and compassion? What's the research have to say about that, and our experience have to say about that? Are there different downstream consequences? So what are the sort of longer-term effects of empathy on one hand versus compassion? So we're going to clarify they actually have sort of divergent consequences in terms of not only our personal well-being, but also in terms of how they orient toward helping others. And then this third one here, can training in compassion lessen empathy's downside while preserving its upside, right? So we're not trying to make empathy go away. We're not saying compassion is better than empathy. It just turns out that compassion includes empathy and it sort of goes beyond. So the answer to that last one, sort of spoiler alert, is yes. Compassion, I think, can preserve the upsides while lessening the downsides. So this gets a little bit intellectual here, but I think it's important because we all use the term empathy and we use terms like compassion, and sometimes we use them interchangeably, right, as synonyms for one another. And even within the science, there is this kind of confusion about what exactly these terms mean. And so it turns out when you look at the scientific literature, that the term empathy gets used for kind of three different things, right? The first of these is something called mind perception, which is that we know that others also have a subjective experience and they have feelings and they can sort of be impacted by what we do, our own behavior and so on. So that's just perceiving that others have a mind, right? It's a less common use of the term empathy, but it does exist in the literature. Then there's this middle one, experience sharing, which is the tendency to actually share in the internal experience that others are having. And this is the main one that we'll be focused on today. And then the third one is called mentalizing, which is more of a kind of cognitive empathy. It has to do with kind of understanding a little bit of the storyline of what might be behind someone's feelings or experience in any given moment. So like I said, we're going to be focused on the second one here, experience sharing, which is actually this sort of automatic tendency of our nervous system to take on the internal states of those around us, right? So if we walk past someone on the street who's sad, we're sort of, even if they're a stranger, there's some part of us that picks up on the cues, maybe their facial expression, their bodily expression, and so on. And actually, we simulate that in our experience automatically, right? This is what the research shows. You may have heard of things like mirror neurons and so on are implicated in this process. And then we end up feeling some sadness ourselves, right? Without even thinking about it, this kind of process occurs. And there's different, degrees of that and so on, depending on how well you know others. Right, so as I'll be presenting and talking about the distinction between compassion and empathy today, it's mostly a distinction between compassion and this version of empathy here, experience and sharing. And as I just said, this is an automatic process. This is important. It's going to be more important, you'll see in a little bit, for understanding the distinction between empathy and compassion. Because empathy, this experience sharing aspect, is occurring largely subconsciously, beneath the surface of our awareness. And so research shows it's actually even irrepressible. So even if you give people like a complex math problem to do in their head, and you show them photos of someone who's in a sad state or a fearful state or an angry state or so on, they'll still do this process of experience sharing even as they're distracted by this cognitive content, right? So we know that it's an automatic process, and that's really, again, it's going to be important for distinguishing from compassion. So if I show you this photo here, see if you can't notice the sort of automatic resonance with this imagery, right? You don't have to will yourself to feel what this person is feeling, most of us. There's just this immediate kind of intuitive feeling state that we feel, not to as strong of a degree maybe as this person would personally. And that differs from if I show you this photo. Didn't do it the other way around, where I show you the happy one first and then the sad one afterward. Okay, so this occurs for both positive and negative states. And as we're going to be talking about it, we're going to be distinguishing compassion specifically from empathy for suffering. Because compassion has to do with an orientation towards suffering, whether in our own or others' experience. Whereas empathy is a bit broader, it can be broader and include positive states as well. So I want to sort of touch into this in your own experience now. What does it feel like to feel empathy for others? So take a moment and think of a student you've worked with. This is a workshop for educators, although you could think of someone else if you don't want to think of a student, or are currently working with who sparks your empathy. You think of them, you immediately have this empathy well up in your experience. And I'd be curious hearing, you can just kind of popcorn and I'll repeat your responses so that people on Zoom can hear too. What is that feeling like for you? What do you notice when you touch into empathy in this way? Is anyone willing to share?
Yeah, the softness to it.
Nice. Yeah. So some kind of softness in your experience, like maybe an opening of the heart a little bit. What else? Anything else you're noticing?
Frustration.
Frustration.
I can't fix it.
Ah, yeah. So there's some kind of tension there, right? You're taking in something, and then what do I do with this? How do I respond to this situation? There's something I want to fix or change. So I'm guessing then you're empathizing with some kind of experience that is distressing, or there's some kind of negative emotional state in the mix.
There are three brothers that I'm thinking of that I've seen at three different buildings because they fought back and forth, and I can't fix their situation.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, three brothers. There's some kind of issue, and there's not an ability to sort of problem solve that issue, and so you're feeling with that situation, but unable to do something about it. Good. Right. Generally, when people feel into empathy, and when they're especially feeling into a situation that involves challenge or difficulty, there's this feeling of sort of being a passive recipient of the information of that person's experience, right? We're sort of feeling what they're feeling with them, right? And that's where empathy sort of ends. Okay, so we're taking in something, taking in some information about what that other person's experience might be like. We're maybe imagining cognitively what might underlie that experience, or we might know some details behind that person's situation. But nonetheless, it's sort of a passive experience. And then, yeah, we're often left with this question of, what do I do about this, right? Now I'm uncomfortable. I know that this person's uncomfortable because I'm empathizing with their experience. What now? So later, I'm going to ask you to call to mind what I call a compassion spark, and we'll see how that differs, okay, from empathy.
And Jordan, a couple quick ones from Zoom that I think are really relevant. One person said helplessness, and another person said it's a feeling of knowing. just knowing exactly what they are feeling.
Great. Yeah, consistent with what I was just saying. Thank you. All right, so a quick way of making this distinction, okay, and if this is all you remember from my talk, I'd be happy with this, okay, is empathy is more about feeling with the experience of others, okay? This is from the perspective of scientific research on this topic. So this experience sharing involves feeling with the internal states of others, right? And as we'll talk about it, compassion is going to be more about feeling for others in their situation. What does that mean, feeling for others? There's an other-oriented emotional state that becomes available with compassion that is different. It is not just about a passive receiving, right? But there's actually going to be this active component with compassion where we're feeling for, there's a different kind of emotional experience that's arising about that person and their situation, or about our own suffering and our situation. So we're not just taking in information now, there's actually an internal response with compassion already. All right, so this has to do with actually sort of jumping ahead, that third question of can compassion training preserve empathy's upsides while decreasing its downsides? Unfortunately, I can't find a more recent citation, like that. No one has replicated this study up to today, but you can see here within society, what you're looking at is trending down of empathy scores. Okay, I think this is in college students. Yeah, college students' empathic concern scores. So in society more broadly right now, we're actually seeing a decrease in empathy, right? And so through compassion, we're not trying to decrease empathy within society, right? I just want to clarify that up front. We're trying to do this both and thing, where we might be able to increase a sort of healthy version of empathy that doesn't burn us out and drain us in the process, right? And we get this these other increased benefits of compassion that have to do with greater likelihood to help others, greater likelihood to respond in effective ways, and so on. So we do have a problem right now in society of decreased empathy. And I think it has a lot to do with technology. And in fact, this publication mentions that this kind of downward trend, corresponds to a rise in the use of smartphones and social media and so on. So that makes sense, right? But compassion is this kind of 2-for-1 deal where we can actually sort of increase empathy within society and decrease some of the downsides like burnout for ourselves when we're working with others. All right, so now we get into the exact definition of compassion. So the first step of compassion, and this isn't really a linear sequence, but we'll present it that way, it's more of a cycle, is becoming more aware of suffering. What is suffering? Suffering is like a kind of, just in this broad sense, distress. Okay, we see that others are stressed out, they're in some kind of situation that's challenging and difficult for them. So we mean suffering here in the broadest sense, not just big suffering, big S, but also little kinds of suffering, just even discomfort. Okay, then there's this feeling for, there's this affective component of compassion. And we're going to get into that more specifically, especially when we try out what a compassion spark is. And then the third piece here is really important. It's connecting our internal experience of noticing suffering, feeling for, with a behavioral aspect. Okay. Now, interestingly, with compassion, it doesn't have to be an external behavior that we enact, but there's more than just a readiness to enact behavior that might help another person or ourselves. So it's more of a motivational and intentional thing than it is an actual behavioral component, but it sort of increases the likelihood of acting in a helpful way. Okay, so as I just said, there's this cognitive, affective, and motivational aspects to compassion. Compassion is actually a kind of a complex internal state. But all three of these aspects orient towards suffering. Suffering is the key focal point of all three of these aspects. And there's this wish or this motivation to alleviate that suffering if possible. Sometimes we can't find a route to actually intervene and do something helpful, in which case it remains more of an internal state, but there's still this wish for the alleviation of suffering in the other by some means, even if it's not from ourselves and our own behavior. So earlier I mentioned how empathy, this experience sharing aspect, is largely subconscious. And that helps us in our social world. We need that piece. It's like a social glue that helps and sort of lubricates or facilitates social synchrony and interaction, right? So we're not trying to get rid of that. But if it just stays at the subconscious level, there's a risk that it drains us and contributes to burnout over time. Compassion, on the other hand, is a more conscious experience, and it allows us to experience both two things together that seemingly are paradoxical. Okay? On one hand, connection through emotion, and on the other hand, some kind of emotional containment. So as I think about it, compassion is kind of a more regulated form of empathy. It's kind of that simple, right? That we can actually feel connected to others emotionally, and we can maintain some sense of differentiation of my emotions from your emotions, what I call emotional autonomy. Okay, so I'm aware where I end and you begin, and I can still feel that connection with you, and I still resonate with what your experience is like, but I'm not having to share in all of its aspects on an ongoing basis. I can touch into that, get the information I need. Ooh, you're in a challenging situation, you're suffering, and then I cultivate this feeling state of care, natural care, and warmth that actually buffers against some of that vicarious stress. Okay, so ultimately, through training in compassion, through the experience of compassion as well as training, which this is how we typically think about compassion at our university and our training programs, it's something that requires practice. But if we get good at this, and we'll touch into this today, there's this potential to dial up and dial down different aspects of empathy dynamically in response to this interpersonal situation. Okay, and when we look at this from the perspective of neuroscience, it also bears out this distinction between empathy and compassion. When people are asked to have an empathy experience, they're watching videos of suffering individuals who are in challenging situations. When they're in a state of empathy, you see areas of the brain activated that have to do with pain, actually, and negative emotionality. And when you ask people subsequent to that task, watching the videos from an empathetic stance, how do you feel after doing that? They report feeling worse off than before the activity. Makes sense, right? It drains them. Now, if you train them in compassion and you ask them to do similar thing, different videos, same task, and you say, we want you to have a compassionate orientation toward those in the videos, you see more activation in areas of the brain that are associated with social affiliation, with social reward, and with positive emotionality. It's not that compassion is a positive emotional state, it's more of a mixed emotional state, right? Or holding suffering within a broader container. But part of what comes online is this feeling for aspect that involves this element of warmth and positive emotionality that provides a little bit of a buffer against that vicarious stress. And in fact, when you ask people subsequent to this task, that were in compassion, how do you feel now after having done this, having watched these videos that are really distressing? They report feeling more positive emotion afterwards. So you just had them watch these videos of people suffering, and now they're feeling better after. And then this other piece of what are the downstream effects, and researchers have studied this. Both experiences of compassion, or this what's going to be called empathic distress, start with the experience of empathy, right? So as I said earlier, compassion includes empathy. It's empathy for suffering. But when you look downstream on the influences this has on an individual over time, it's really interesting that if someone stays in this state of empathy and does not sort of meet that moment with this other aspect that we're going to get into, this more active internal component of feeling for, then it has the potential to become a more self-oriented emotion. So empathy is about another person, right? but it can collapse into a self-related emotion that involves these more negative feelings, and that contributes over time to poor health and burnout, okay, especially for people that work in professions where you're encountering a lot of suffering day in and day out. And really interestingly, that's not a state that's well conducive to actually helping, because it becomes really about oneself. Now I have to deal with the stress myself, and I'm not sure quite what to do with it. I'm having difficulty regulating and so on. And so I'm no longer paying attention to the person who's suffering. Compassion, on the other hand, is an other-oriented emotion, and it involves these more positive feelings. And the research shows that training in this and the experience of it contribute to better health over the long term and increase the likelihood of actually intervening and helping others in beneficial ways. So this is what I mean, this 2-for-1 deal of compassion, right? Where we're both resonating with the experience of others, we're taking that in, we're not turning away from the suffering of the world, and we're not necessarily having to share in that suffering in order to do something helpful. All right, so this gets to a distinction that maybe is coming up for you. So listen to this if you've heard about something called compassion fatigue. And so there's debates actually within the scientific literature whether that's a bit of a misnomer. And that's our view in our compassion training program, is that this term compassion fatigue is a misnomer. Really what is being talked about in that literature is more like empathy fatigue. Okay? Or we could say it's that empathic distress fatigue, that right pathway here that you're seeing. And it's interesting when you look at why this experience of empathy might contribute to fatigue over time. And it has to do with not just taking in and experiencing the suffering that others are feeling, but also our attempts to avoid that experience. So most of us, our default response when we are encountering the suffering of others day in and day out is to try and kind of suppress or avoid that experience. But as I said earlier, empathy is something natural to us. It's automatic. And so it's unavoidable, actually. It's irrepressible, as I mentioned earlier. So it's a lot of wasted effort and energy to try and experientially avoid something that we can't, right? And so what compassion does is it says, okay, this is an inevitable aspect of my experience. Instead of trying to avoid empathy, I'm going to lean in to this empathic response. I'm going to become more aware of this empathic response. And I'm going to transform this empathic response into something that is good for me and good for you. And over time, that can give us more energy rather than contributing to burnout. Sometimes it's still like a little challenging to understand this. How is it that this could be beneficial, or why is it that trying to avoid empathy wouldn't work? So I like to do this little activity. And so I'll invite you to do this now. Sincerely, over the next 30 seconds, try not to think of a white bear. Close your eyes if you want to. Just try not to think of a white bear. Did we succeed? Is it working? Not think of a white bear. It was originally an observation of Dostoevsky. I think I said that right. Maybe that's the most challenging part of this talk for me today. In 1863, he said, try to pose for yourself this task, not to think of a polar bear, and you will see that the cursed thing will come to mind every minute. Okay? So we didn't do it for that long. Sometimes people succeed actually in not thinking of the white bear. But research shows then there's something called a rebound effect, where after you let off the brake, then the white bear comes to mind more frequently subsequently. Okay. So what this shows is there's this kind of paradoxical effect of trying to avoid something experientially. And research shows that more of our brain then goes to processing that thing than would have been otherwise. So when we try and avoid something, more of our brain is actually processing that thing than would have otherwise. And so that causes it to come to mind more frequently, or subsequent to suppressing it effectively, it comes to mind after, or it comes to our experience afterwards. Similar thing with empathy, okay? Empathy fatigue. Can't avoid it. When we try and avoid it, we're actually giving rise maybe to more of it. Okay, so I said we'd be clarifying what compassion is, both at a conceptual and experiential level. In a moment, we're going to do a little experiential activity that helps to clarify this. Just pause here and see if there's any questions about the more intellectual side of this so far. No, we're all good? Okay, so we're going to try something out. Kind of experiential exploration of compassion from the inside out. We're going to orient toward our own experience. So this is going to be a kind of self-compassion practice, but you could do a similar thing, applying this to others. And then we'll talk about, I'll share how you might use the similar activity in a classroom or something like that if you want to do that. Okay. So part of this is what I call a compassion spark. So I'm going to be asking you to think about something that sparks this feeling of inner warmth from you when you call it to mind. Give you a few examples. Actually, research supports what I'm about to show here. For many people, this is a pet or an animal. So maybe an unfortunate truth, but research shows it's easier for people to feel this compassion spark, this inner warmth, the natural affection, this opening of the heart for an animal than another human. Okay. Maybe it's easier with kids too. But it can also be a gesture, like sometimes people put their hand on their heart, something's more somatic, kind of brings that feeling to them. But for me, yeah, when I look at sort of cute animal pictures, or when I think of animals, pets that I know, there's that kind of automatic sense of natural care and affection, which I could describe as a kind of inner warmth. So thinking about what that is for you. And it can be challenging initially to come up with this. So if you're not coming up with something that is that spark for you, keep an eye out, over the next few days or so. Something will come into your experience and you'll feel that spark. So if you can't locate it now, that's all right. All right, and we're going to use this compassion spark in order to experience compassion from the inside out. So the first piece of this is kind of called an on-the-spot self-compassion. We can practice this anywhere, anytime. Okay. The first step is noticing suffering. And again, as we're talking about suffering here, it's this broad umbrella term that includes all sorts of things, like any kind of pain or discomfort, fear, struggle, maybe even wanting to be somewhere other than we currently are, where we currently are. So there's this gap in our experience. So tuning into our own experience now and noticing, where is it that I notice some kind of discomfort? Could be an idea, something that you're worried about too. So once we tune into that, it's a little bit like empathizing with ourselves. Right? We're noticing that there's some discomfort in our experience. The second piece, we're going to let that go for a moment, and we're going to spark warmth. We're going to use our compassion spark. So whatever it is that you had thought up that allows you to connect with this. So this is the start, this compassion spark is the start of this feeling for. This natural affection, this opening of the heart allows us to begin to feel for. And so then we're going to see if we can't bring this quality of inner warmth, of natural affection and care back toward ourselves, okay? Feeling for the one who is suffering. In this case, back to what we were noticing in our experience, that discomfort. We actually feel this care and orient it toward ourselves. And then traditionally in this practice, we move to a final step that has to do with articulating this in the form of a wish for ourselves. Okay? So we can use a traditional wish, like, may I be free from this suffering? May I be free of this pain? Doesn't mean in this moment, may I be free of that? That's trying to fix or change our experience in a way that would be manipulative or self-aggressive, actually. Instead, we're just wishing, it's like a kind of aspiration that somehow, in some way, we might have some alleviation. Alternatively, sometimes it's helpful and it helps us deepen the experience to come up with our own wish that's unique to our situation. May I feel less anxiety? Right? May my back pain go away? May this challenging social situation that I'm thinking about be resolved to the benefit of both me and this other person. Ideally, whatever this wish is, we can repeat it to ourselves internally, and it's sort of like fueling the fire here. We've got that spark, we have that feeling for ourselves, and then this wish allows us to grow that feeling and circulate that within our experience. So you could bring this into the classroom, right? I know we have a mix of educators in the audience today. Some people work with maybe college students, some work with elementary or other age groups. So some of this might not be appropriate depending on the age group you're working with. But I think just identifying your compassion spark is a nice activity. Okay, you don't have to go fully to the degree that we just did, where you then incorporate it into a full compassion practice and so on. You could do this full on-the-spot self-compassion, maybe at the start of class or something like that, help people arrive, tune into their experience. But you could also do an activity where you have people think about this and write about it, maybe draw it, or maybe with little kids you do some kind of show and tell around this. They get to talk about their pet, right? And then you might ask them, you might ask yourself in this moment, what would it be like to feel the same caring attitude toward myself? Is it possible to imagine that? Especially when I'm struggling with something. What if in the moment I could disrupt that self-critical narrative, this feeling of care and affection? Okay, so we wanted to hear from you all, but first see if you're open to this, and I know that it's going to be a little different for people in the Zoom. You could share in the chat in the Zoom. Maybe you're open to sharing with another person here in the room. What is that compassion spark for you? What is it that actually brings about that? And were you able to connect with something? That's the first question, I guess. And if so, what is that thing? Or you could talk a little bit about what that on-the-spot practice was like for you. And you could even talk about, if you want something more neutral or something, you could talk about how you might bring this into the classroom with your students. It doesn't have to be a personal share. But if you could turn to somebody nearby, if you're comfortable with this, just kind of share for a moment. And the people in the Zoom, maybe you can share in the chat, what is this for you that brings about this feeling?
And the truth is, like, I would say, I'm not catching. All you know, the only thing that we have to do
Wrapping up your conversations. Maybe I'll ask Thomas in a moment. So we'll come back to the group attention. Thanks. So maybe we'll start with Thomas, people maybe sharing on Zoom what's coming up for them, and then we'll see if others are open to sharing a little bit about anything that's been talked about so far. If you have questions too.
Absolutely. So we had some great ones come on Zoom. We had the sound of children's laughter, images of my children and myself happy and playing in the sunlight, kids or pets sleeping or playing, adults laughing to tears when my 10-year-old and 10-month-old grandchildren interact. And then I love this one. There is no place I would rather be. There is no one I would rather be with. There is nothing I would rather be doing. Be it kids or pets sleeping or playing. Mountains and anything outdoors in nature. And then a philosophy professor in Missoula said to have an inventory of memories that these are true for. I think those memories could be sparks. And I agree with that one. And then me personally, it's my cat Rizzy. Her coming in the morning, every morning. She comes down, lays accordion style. I love it. We have our little love session.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Thanks to everyone who shared in the chat. Those are great examples. I especially like this idea of an inventory of possible memories, to draw from. So we don't need just one compassion spark, right? We can have many of these things, and they could potentially sort of all appear in our awareness more naturally. Anyone here want to share what came up for you, and I can repeat it in the mic?
Pulling in that 36-inch leg.
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Pulling in that 36-inch leg out of that hole in the ice.
Ah, okay, so this is a fishing example here? Yeah, I see, gotcha. Sorry, I missed that at first. Nice, so that brings about that spark. It's interesting, it's ice, because then it brings out the sense of inner warmth still, right? So that experience helps you feel that moment. Anyone else want to share? Oh, Heather? Yeah.
We all said our dogs.
Oh, dogs too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, pets, right? It's interesting how pets help us feel this. Think about how that contributes to our well-being on a daily basis, to be able to touch into that state each time, kind of more naturally. So what is the compassion spark from a research perspective? Okay, I just want to briefly touch on this. And then I think we've got time to do one other little brief experiential here that applies to the classroom again. So from a scientific perspective, neuroscientific perspective, this is talked about in terms of something called proactive emotion generation. Okay, so if you want the formal term for that, I leave it until now because it's kind of a mouthful. Proactive emotion generation. Okay, this is an interesting distinction between emotions as something that happen to us. Okay, so are we just passive recipients to our emotional life? Or are we active participants in our emotions? Are we actually, do we have some creative say about the emotional landscape that we're experiencing in any given moment? And what research shows is that people can naturally come to this as well, but they can learn strategies to become guides that sort of invite us into different emotional states, generally the emotional states we would want to be in, so sort of more wholesome or more positive emotional states. So using this technique, often a memory or thinking of a specific other, is a kind of way of initiating a positive emotional experience, self-generating an emotion, right? And in the context of a situation where there's some kind of empathy for suffering happening, that spark offers us that buffer that helps us maintain a sense of emotional autonomy in that situation. That positive emotion becomes like an experience of space around the empathy for suffering, right? Around the experience sharing that we're having, where now we're having a different experience. We're having this positive emotional experience, or more of a mixed emotional state, right? Of this natural caring and affection for the one who is suffering. We're not just in it with them, which kind of just multiplies the suffering, right? So we've got the emotional autonomy and connectedness at the same time, or what I could say is connection and containment together in the same experience. So if there's not questions, I'm going to do one last little on the spot practice that I think applies to the classroom. But first I want to see, are there questions about this, or like, it could even be like a skepticism or something like that. I like challenging questions. Please.
What is the difference in this experience when it's obviously when we're face to face with somebody, it can be a lot easier, right, to generate this. So
Yeah.
what are you guys seeing as far as maybe ways to apply this when we're through technology? Because even right, it's all different. It's a much different thing. So how do you find that there's techniques or things that you would recommend?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of what's difficult about the Zoom world that we're living in, right, is that it already dampens empathy, right? So that initial experience sharing aspect, like we might not even know that someone's struggling, right? So I think that is harder to overcome. But I think the same steps would apply once we're actually in that moment of experience sharing. If we can remember in that moment, oh, I'm feeling that achiness, I'm feeling the heaviness of what this person's feeling. And I don't, research shows this is not necessarily the most beneficial state for me to be in, even for this other person. Right? I think sometimes we think it's more beneficial to be in that stuck place with them. That's the sort of empathy response, right? If we can remember in that moment to kind of spark that warmth, right? We could literally use our compassion spark. And then we find within ourselves a resourcefulness to actually respond from a different place, okay? And maybe that response is just offering voicing our care and concern for this person and their situation. Or it could be, and often what happens is that spark opens up a sense of possibility, right? So I'll get into this in tonight's talk probably, but if you've ever heard of this theory called broaden and build theory of positive emotions, right? So part of what's happening in that spark moment is positive emotion is coming online. And we know from research that positive emotion expands the scope of attention and awareness and allows us to think up new possibilities, right? So it actually helps us problem solve in situations where people are feeling stuck. And so that's another reason or another way that we can understand from a mechanism standpoint how it is that that compassion spark is increasing the likelihood of effective helping of the other person. But yeah, it is tricky. It's definitely. Any other questions, comments? Right, I'll actually pause here. We were going to take a little 5-minute break, if that's okay. Just kind of like, we like to model self-compassion here, right? So just taking a moment to do what you need to do, maybe stretch break, maybe get a drink of water or use the restroom. And then Charlotta's going to pick us up after the break in terms of we're going to do some more experientials and learn more about this.
Always gives, I always love it. I know there's like a smoothness and that keeps just increasing the lubrication, the ease.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, you experience that too with this stuff, right?
Yeah. I know it's different, you know, we're trying different ways. Anyway, I was just very much appreciating this the way and the subtleties also, like which subtleties to pull out.
Yep. Yeah, it just shows, you know, like, yeah, I mean, teaching live and teaching repeatedly content over and over again is the way. And like, what are we going to lose if we're going to these recorded lectures?
Yeah.
It just becomes maybe too much in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also, you know, Mama Rod Owens, I was just reading this piece that I assigned for class, which calls it.
Hi. Yeah.
I left my mask.
Okay. Yeah, let's keep this on. Sorry, say that one time. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And I
I have
told
a friend who does something like this. Yeah.
because I also teach diabetes, chronic pain, chronic disease.
Yeah.
But in order to get certified, I had to teach this cancer class.
Oh, interesting.
And it's real interesting, and you made these comments between compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
As I noticed when I took the class, which is what I was teaching, it's a 6-week class.
Yeah.
And it was,
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Right.
But now it's making more sense to me.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. Right.
some of the men, well,
Yeah.
we won't get
So much-
graphic,
so
but
much
it was
pain.
different, yes. And still,
Yeah.
what would you suggest?
Right.
Because obviously I'm absorbing
Right.
what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. So this has to do with, I will put my mask on just to be
Yes.
extra safe. It's fine. This has to do with, yeah, like, you know, there is this real detrimental influence, but
stronger for some people than others, right? So there's this term that you maybe have heard of, being an empath. Have you ever heard of that term? So this is something I have quite a bit of research interest in. Like, what exactly does that mean, right? And actually research suggests, there's not really such thing as an empath, right? Like there are people who score higher on empathy scales than others, but generally I think what that means is that we are struggling with the subconscious level of this, right? We're picking up a lot of stuff on a subconscious level. So on one hand, I think the kind of tools that I'm talking about today really do have a beneficial influence on this. They offer actually an interesting kind of connection, especially for people that have high empathy. So you don't have to feel as much with that suffering. On the other hand, I don't think that that's going to go away overnight for you, right? So like, you're in this environment now, you're being asked to continue doing this, and it's really challenging for you. So I think the question would be, are you willing to see this as a practice where you can start applying these tools, or is it too much? If it's too much, I mean, I think that clinicians trained for years to get ready for that kind of situation. So it's no small thing, what you're doing. Yeah.
And yes, I have heard of it.
Yeah. And I do think that there are some exercises you could do, like clearing exercises afterwards and before too, to feel like you're not taking it home,
Now, I have a problem when it comes to diabetes.
Yeah. Right, which is what you're trying to get into. Yeah, right. Right.
I just couldn't have what I told you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this applies to your situation, but in my training, in graduate school and so on, they always said, this gets to be your reference point from here on out. This is the most difficult. This is the busiest you'll ever be. This is the hardest you'll ever work. So you can always look at your future and say, at least it's not as bad as, which maybe is what this class will be. When you go out and be a clinician with the populations you're really wanting to work with, you'll be able to say, this is bad, but it's not as bad as.
Right.
Yeah, but I feel for you. That's a really challenging thing to work with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so let's come back. So I'd like to continue our exploration and dive into compassion and what it is and how we can tap into it, and really begin to see compassion as a resource, and as a resource for resilience. This term resilience, that in the face of challenge, the face of obstacles, which are part of human existence, that compassion can actually be something that we turn towards, that we tap into as a way to be resilient within challenge. And so one of the studies that Jordan drew from a lot in his presentation, there's a wonderful description. One of the people who was put through this study of, you saw the brain images of empathy and then of compassion. And so when he described his empathic response to seeing these images of suffering, he described how difficult it was, how badly he felt, how constricted he felt. And then when he started practicing compassion in watching the same images, and the images were of children in an orphanage that were they were not receiving the care that they needed. And he writes about turning towards compassion, and that something opened in him, this sense of profound connection to these children, profound love for these children, the sense of humanity, of connecting with them as a fellow human being, even in their suffering. But that sense of connectedness was profoundly inspiring for him. And so I'd like to pull out this, what is really a key aspect of compassion, which is our are tapping into the felt experience of interconnectedness or interdependence, or what we might call, and this is often used in compassion research and compassion and training as well, the sense of our common humanity. And that there's something so powerful in that experience. And the second piece that will come into this is also that in tapping into a sense of interconnectedness, we experience agency, empowerment, that it's actually an incredibly empowering sense when we tap into common humanity. So I'll draw these out a little bit more. And first I wanted to note, I think we're all aware of this, of the tendency in our culture to feel quite isolated, to think of ourselves as separate beings going along our separate lives, and then there are a few other separate beings that are in our boat. But we're a highly individualized, individualistic society. Where we're staying in a very lovely hotel by the river, and it's beautiful. I got up this morning, and it was just me, and I had my own microwave, and I actually have 2 beds, and I have my own shower. And I thought, wow, here are all these other rooms, right? We're all individually in our own shower. And it's wonderful, right? It's a luxury. And at the same time, is it isolating? It's kind of just me. I have 2 boys, and I have 2 cats, and I have a husband, and so there's a lot of noise on me, so that probably contributes. But what does that do to us? In some ways, it makes us feel like our problems are ours alone. And there's a tendency when we suffer, in particular, when we feel pain, or even in the experiences of empathy that Jordan showed us and invited us into, to retract, right? To feel like it's my problem. And we tend, the more uncomfortable we feel, the less social we are, right? The less we reach out, the more likely we're to say, you know what, I'm not going to go out for a drink with friends. I'm just going to go home and watch TV. So we pull back. We go to the back of the cave, our primordial cave. So, and then when we look at suffering of others, we also get into this tendency of separation. Either that sense of like, I have to fix it, right? As somebody shared, like, I feel like I want to fix it, but I can't. So there's a quality of disempowerment. I can't do anything about it. When we hear news of halfway across the world, right? That's what happens to me. I'm driving in my car. What can I do? I feel so small. I feel so separate. Or we might say, you know what? That's their problem. I'm going to walk away. It's their problem. Nothing to do with it. So compassion is an invitation to notice our interconnectedness. To begin by noticing it, and then actually to begin to feel into it. To let it be the reality through which we're swimming. The reality that we're continuously moving through. It's not a choice. Am I interconnected? Am I interdependent? But actually waking up to what I would say is actually the fact of life. And so compassion is an invitation to practice that awareness, that recognition. So I like to start this inquiry into interconnectedness with very simple things. So if I look at this room right now, and there's a good handful of us here and another 12 or so on Zoom. So there's a sense of connection. We've decided to be here. But then what about this floor? Where did this floor come from? I'm not sure if it's real wood or not real wood, but let's say it's real wood. Where did that wood come from? Which forests on our earth did it grow in? What was the rain that fell on those trees? What was the sun? Who were those people who cut down those trees? Who made the machines to help them cut the trees? Who transported them? Where did that oil come from that went into the trucks that brought the wood here? Who put the polyurethane on, the varnish on? Where did that come from? Who put in the lights? Literally, who got on a ladder and put up that light? Maybe some of you even know who built this room, some of the human beings. But right now, the person who put up that light, hopefully, is alive and well, doing something in this moment. What are they doing? Are they having lunch? Are they taking a nap? Are they happy? Are they sad? But in some ways, right, we're completely impacted by who they are, what they do. So we could go on, we could spend the entire rest of the day or week just going through the chairs. Or let's take a look at our clothes, right? Who sewed our clothes? Whose hands went into this linen, this skirt? What did we have for lunch today? We met the guy who delivered. So we got to know him, but who made those? And we are that, right? We are all of those things. That network of interconnectedness. Driving is a wonderful example of this too. Because we're in our isolated cars, right? Me in my car, and I got my music and my heat, and just the way I like the fan or the windows open. But then there are all these other people in the world. And for the most part, we like to just ignore them if all goes well. But really, don't our lives depend on those other people? Right? Of them not doing something out of the ordinary, going into our lane suddenly. I grew up in New York City, and you just cross the street, and the light turns green, and as a pedestrian, you just cross the street. But really, my life depends on those people at the red light putting their foot on the brake. And I walk by and I happily go on with my day, but really, maybe wouldn't it be more appropriate to say, thank you, thank you, thank you for giving me my life, for protecting my life. So I wonder if any of you you think about interconnectedness in this very ordinary way. How do you notice this in your everyday life? Is there anything that comes up for you? And those of you in chat, if you want to write something in the chat, where do you notice interconnectedness with other beings most, would you say? Not just humans, obviously, it's also animal beings, plant beings. I'm not going to call on you, Jordan, yet. Someone go first so Jordan can also share.
Where I work.
Will you say a little bit?
Where you work, will you say a little bit more?
I work for a nonprofit organization.
Well, you know what, there's a mic that Thomas has, let's use that.
Sorry. Where I work for a nonprofit organization, so I notice the interconnectedness with the staff and our volunteers, but also the youth that we serve and the community that supports the work we do. So it's all very connected.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, Jordan.
I was just thinking about this. We recently flew on a plane to get here. And every time I get on a plane, actually, this is like a contemplation that just arises for me is all of these other people are coming from who knows where, and we're all in this little, plane together. In this moment, we're sharing a destiny. I mean, hopefully the plane gets there on time. So, but then we land and we all go our separate directions again, right? But it's almost like we're suspended for a moment. We are literally suspended in the sky, but it's like we're suspended in time for a moment, all sharing in that kind of experience. And these are usually complete strangers, and I may never encounter them again, but somehow we all booked the same flight, and we all needed to be in Great Falls, yesterday. and things like that. So that's when it comes up most strongly for me.
Well, I love the sporting events, right? And it's because they're just, I mean, who really cares, right? You're just hitting the ball or something, whatever it is. But that feeling you get of being in the crowd and you're all in your gear and face painting and all that is, you just feel like, yeah, I mean, we're all in this together.
Beautiful. And I think maybe that's what we've missed in this COVID time, right? So few opportunities to come together in that way as a humanity. And yet, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I do a lot of teaching via Zoom. And in this year, I've been in Zooms with people halfway across the world. You know, this guy is like, it's 3 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand, but I really wanted to be here with you. Or people in Europe and it's in the evening, you know, and suddenly you realize in this moment, we're all together. And it's such a beautiful sense of togetherness and connectedness and sharing something. And that really, right, this is another spark of compassion, as Jordan was talking about it. So what are the implications of interdependence? One is we begin to realize that we have impact, that things have impact on us. And we know this about actions, right? We do something, it has an effect, and then the whole thing changes, right? I told you I have kids, so in the morning we have a very tight schedule. Like at 7:10, I have to leave to bring one son to the bus station in order to be back at 7:30 to bring my other one. And if anything goes wrong, you know, if I don't put my honey in the tea quickly enough, then we're off 2 minutes, and then the whole day is messed up, right? So we know about impact of actions. What about impact of speech? I think we've all grown up with that saying, like, sticks and stones, words, yeah, sticks and stones can hurt my bones, but words can never hurt me, or something like that. And I almost wonder if it should be the other way around. Because bruises can heal, but words, the power of words. So when we begin to tap into, recognize the impact we have, the sense of interconnectedness, the power of words to actually affect other beings. And then feelings, right? Our feelings impact others, particularly those close around us, right? You wake up in the morning and someone's grumpy, and you can feel all day how that affects how you are, how you move through your day. So we are always affecting each other continuously. This whole idea of a separate me with my own shower at Best Western quickly begins to crumble the minute I walk out the room or turn on my Zoom or make a phone call. We begin to tap into the sense of beingness, the web of beingness. And I wanted to share, you probably know this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. from his letter from a Birmingham jail, but to me it's one of the most beautiful descriptions of this interdependence that we're talking about here. He says, in a real sense, all of life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So when we begin to tap into this interconnectedness, interdependence, I think a few things start to happen. One, I'd like to say, is there's a sense of relief. We're not alone. We're actually never alone. And we can begin to perhaps feel held within this inescapable network of mutuality. We begin to recognize that we exist because of the support of countless beings, right? Our parents to start with, the guy who put up that light, the person who made our lunch. The reason we're here, the reason we're alive is because we have received so much kindness. And so we can turn towards it. We can recognize it. We can actually take it in. When we are alone, when we feel lonely, when we feel isolated, when we feel burnt out, when we feel stressed, we can actually breathe in what we perceive because we constantly are. And there's a quality of gratitude, right? There's some beautiful practices, my gratitude practice every day. You know, what am I grateful for? And really that's a recognition of interdependence, a recognition of interconnectedness. And the other aspect here, the kind of relief, is that the world doesn't rest on our shoulders alone. We aren't the only one trying to make it all better. We're in a web of creating a better future, of helping other beings, of helping ourselves, our communities. And I think as educators, or those of you, you know, guessing in some sort of field of engaging with society and community, right? We're one piece of this much larger web. So there's a sense of relief we can take in that. And then there's a sense of agency, and I mentioned this before. We are in this web. Everything we do affects everything, which means we have incredible power, right? If we sense that way in which we're all connected, then everything I do actually has impact. Everything matters. I can affect change. I am not powerless. And it's both a way of recognizing our agency and also, this is the flip side of it, radical responsibility. We are all in it together. I think of this, you know, Jordan's again, spark of compassion and expanding it and feeling like, what if we're all like a sun or like a star in the sky, right? That everything we do is expanding like rays of the sun. How might we move through our lives in that way? We realize everything had an impact. And I think in some ways, compassion and also is this practice of awareness of who do we miss? What do we miss? Whom do we not take into consideration as we recognize this web of mutuality? In compassion training, we talk about the neutral people, which are the people who are neither our closest friends nor our enemies. They all get the, you know, and if our movies, if our life is like a movie, the people we love and the people we hate are all show up on the credits, right? They get the starring roles. But then the neutral people are like the extras, right? They never even show up in the credits. Who do we miss? Who do we just pass by, not even recognize? That's why this kind of contemplation of the space or our clothes or what we eat can be very helpful, because usually those are the neutral people. So whom in our lives, who's that neutral student, perhaps? That neutral community member? We sort of ignore because they're not difficult, or someone we love. What parts of ourselves do we ignore, right? Compassion is all the way through, meaning it's self and other continuously. We'll talk about this more tonight, so I hope you'll come. Difficult people, right? From this web of interconnectedness, no out. Can't get rid of anyone. So my analogy or my metaphor that I like to use is trash. So within our beautifully sanitary world, I have this great thing that happens at my house that I put all of my trash in a white plastic bag, and it's got this red plastic ribbon. And I tie it up when it's full and I bring it down to the dumpster at the bottom of my driveway. And Thursdays, it all goes away. And I come back to the dumpster and it's empty. And it's so wonderful, right? I get rid of my trash once a week. It's gone. Kind of sometimes we wish there were people like that in our lives, right? Or situations. We wish we could put in a nice white plastic bag and put a red ribbon around, and Thursdays it would disappear. Or parts of ourselves, right? Parts of yourselves, right? So from one perspective, I get rid of it. But if I expand my sense of what home is, even slightly, I have to recognize that garbage just went in a truck that went to the transfer station, it's going into a landfill, maybe into outer space, maybe into an ocean. So if I'm really going to expand my sense of home, I never got rid of garbage, I just moved it around. Can we get rid of the difficult people in our lives? Can we get rid of the difficult parts of ourselves? Not really. And so compassion is saying that recognition can't get rid of it. So what's my relationship going to be to it? I am inextricably, right, again, Martin Luther King's words, inextricably in relationship. But what's the nature of that relationship? And compassion is saying, I will turn towards it. I will meet it. And I will extend some sense of warmth, some sense of understanding. It's not being a doormat. It's not being walked over. It's having a living boundary, a living relationship of acknowledgement. Okay. So just one last thing, and then we'll do something fun. The resilience of compassion again. So I think coming back, when we come into the sense of interconnectedness, interdependence, that sense of everything having impact, everything mattering, having agency, having being empowered, that's the resilience of compassion as well. So interdependence gives us resilience. Okay, now I'm going to do a little thing together and invite us to do, which is just a way of, again, tapping into the sense of interconnectedness. So those of you on Zoom, if you have any possibility where you are to take 2 minutes to go get ideally a piece of chocolate wrapped in a wrapper, but if you were in my house, it would always be available, but you might not have that. So any little something to eat that you like, I'll give you 2 minutes to get up and go to the fridge or the cupboard. And if you don't have something, then don't worry about it. And I'm going to hand out something to those of you here.
So Elsie took me to the candy shop today, and you said, "Oh, I'll come earlier." Yeah, guys, an hour earlier. So at this point, just hold on to it. Did I get everyone? Except for Jordan? Okay.
Okay. So
Here's what we're going to do before we open it. I'm going to invite us into an open popcorn, including all of you on Zoom. What went into this? Sugar, great. Where does sugar come from, do we think? Sugar beets, sugar cane, corn? Farms. Where does sugar, yeah, go ahead.
Definitely the cocoa bean in probably a third world country for a person that is probably getting $1.50 an hour and working 15-hour shifts.
Okay, cocoa bean coming from a third world country, harvested by someone who is perhaps getting $1.50 for 15 hours of work. Just coming back to sugar cane, I started an incredible report about Dominican Republic, where much of our sugar comes from, and the conditions of people cutting sugar cane. So this is, this is, everything is included, right? This is beautiful chocolate. We're gonna have a lot of joy with this, but this is good. We've already gone deep into politics and economics, and we're just looking at a little Halloween candy. Okay, what else? Tin foil. Where does tin foil come from? Mines. Does anyone know where? I have no idea. Okay, somewhere in the earth comes the metal we call tin foil. Okay, what else went into this?
The factory where it's stamped and crafted.
Right, yeah, so the factory, I wondered maybe there were even a couple, right? So there was the one that you were talking about, stamping it, wrapping it up. Yeah. The artist. Yeah, and we've got different ones. So I've got the like angry pumpkin. I think some of you got coins, golden coins. Ooh, Jordan got the skull. Skeleton. Okay, so there were some artists, designers. What else? Transporting of it, right? So probably maybe even boats, trucks, planes.
The candy store, taking it out, putting it away and bringing it up for you.
Exactly. Beautiful young woman who helped me with my plastic glove to reach in and get it. Then there's milk, right? There's probably milk in this. So we've got cows, grass, we've got the farmers taking care of the cows, milking them, transporting. I'm sure we've missed 1,000 things. Okay, so let's do this as just a short kind of contemplative practice of, did anything come in via Zoom? No. Okay, Zoom folks, you're invited. Please share your voice, and Thomas will share with us along the way. So let's just take a minute here, and I'll stop talking in just a second, but feeling into, as you hold this web of connection in just this one little piece of chocolate. With different parts of our globe, of the earth, there's plants, and animals, with human beings who worked hard, who were joyful, who were perhaps sad. Almost we can feel it's like threads in a spider web, all these threads going out just from this little piece, all across the earth, all kinds of beings. And if you would like, we can eat it. And those of you on Zoom, whatever you've chosen, you have something tapping into all the ways that thing connects you to other beings, Earth. And as we eat, it's almost an act of connection, right, with all those beings. So take a moment to have our chocolate. And as we enjoy this, one thing I love to do is on this network, a spider web of connection, almost like an electrical grid going out to all these other beings, is send out gratitude and send out a wish for their happiness, their well-being, all those beings that contributed to giving us something of sustenance, something that brings us some joy. And thank them for their work. May they have happiness in the causes of happiness. Okay. So thank you for indulging me in doing one of my favorite activities, which is eating chocolate. As Jordan shared, the compassion spark that can be taken into the classroom. This is one that I love to do with all ages of beings, as you can tell, because it's something we do all the time. We eat all the time. And it's such a key part of being human and of our own health and well-being, and so intimately connects us in so many ways to so many others. So however you want to do this or integrate it, I invite you to do so. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. Well, let me just see, is there any other comments, questions about anything we've done so far? Yes.
Just sitting here, I just realized this is actually something my kids and I do when we hear a siren or see a police car, an ambulance, fire truck. Dear God, keep them safe. And it's not just them, it's the people that are going to help, it's the people on the road, it's the person in the ambulance. And it's like, oh my God, we do this and it's so simple and you don't even think about it. But we do that on a regular basis all the time.
That's wonderful. Just for those of you on Zoom, what was shared was, what is your name?
Stacy.
Stacy sharing of being with her kids and hearing an ambulance and then sending out a prayer. May those beings be safe and well, and all those involved, driving and caring and so forth, and how that just comes naturally, just as part of what you do. And yes, right, how beautiful, right? Because often when we see something like that, there can also be the tendency of like, oh, poor them, or oh God, I'm so glad it's not me. And we all do that too, so no judgment on that, right? I'm so glad it wasn't me, or it wasn't someone I love. And our capacity to connect in a really beautiful way. This is the wishing of compassion, that compassion is active. Sometimes we can do something, but often, most of the time, probably, our action is about wishing, is about sending that prayer, sending that wish, connecting in some way with that being. So thank you, Stacy. Anyone else? Question, comment? Shift. Okay. All right, Jordan, back to you.
Sitting a little while, most of this workshop has been seated. We're going to shift gears a little bit just to get some more energy and dynamism into our exploration of what we've been learning about now. So I invite you, whatever you need to do to get ready, to stand up, and you're going to be walking around the room. Those on Zoom, I also invite you to stand up, and you're going to participate I'll provide some cues, participate in this in a slightly different way, but I'll provide some cues. It's going to largely be a kind of awareness practice more than a kind of compassion practice, but we'll bring compassion into the mix. Though compassion doesn't usually take place in this kind of situation where we're sort of sitting on our own, this kind of clean and tidy thing, right? It's usually messier, it's usually in the midst of busyness or activity. And so I'm going to invite you actually to start walking about the room, and we'll use this whole space. And I invite the people here, please also walk in front of the camera occasionally so that the people on Zoom get a kind of taste of what's happening here too. But we call this sometimes in Europa aimless wandering. So I invite you to aimlessly wander around the room, wherever your sense of guidance or whatever wants to take you. Bring our compass. And we don't have to move quickly, move as slowly as we want, or as quickly as we want. Just tuning in, what is it that's guiding your sense of where you want to go next? How do you know where you want to go? And so for those people on Zoom, also meandering about your space a little bit right now. So can you locate in your body, maybe, where the sense of wanting to go is coming from? Or is it more of a mental thing, where you're headed next? The next thing I invite you to become more aware of is what you notice as you pass by others. What shifts in your experience as you get close, or even just someone passes in your field of awareness? Similarly, for those tracking through Zoom, what do you notice as someone walks by the camera? What shifts in your experience as you take in that other person? Does it affect you to pass by another person? Even if you're not overtly interacting with them or looking at them, that's not a requirement of this. Is there, like Charlotte said, some kind of invisible connective thread? Or maybe some automatic empathy or experience sharing that's happening? And we can pick up the pace a little bit. So try what that's like, pick up the pace. And as you pass by others, do you notice any pockets of tension or relaxation in your body? Does that correspond to how close or far away you are from others? And now, I invite you to call again to mind that compassion spark from earlier as you meander around. What was it? What was that thing? Your cat or your dog, or the sounds of children laughing, or fishing in ice. How does that change your sense of self as you meander around? Does it offer actually a sense of more containment to feel that compassion spark? And lastly, I invite you to see, can you extend this feeling of warmth just invisibly, without even overtly changing anything, just as an internal experience? Can you feel it radiating out from you toward the others in this space? Or if you're on Zoom, the people who walk by. This kind of warmth, and imagine it, visualize it radiating out from your heart center. We might finally articulate this in a wish for those that we pass by, or those in this space, or those that we see. May you be happy. If that doesn't land for us, we can change up the words. May you be well. May you feel connected. May you have the energy for whatever is coming up after this workshop. All right, you can return to our seats whenever you feel ready. Thanks for getting on your feet for that after eating lunch and dessert, no less.
Okay. Yeah, try that.
We'll do one more final thing to close. I just want to check the comments about Zoom real quick. So I'm going to give instructions, and then I think in the Zoom, we'll put people into a breakout group or a couple breakout groups if possible. I'm just going to try that out. So if you're on Zoom and that makes you feel a sense of panic, know that it's optional, that you go into the breakout room and you can do this on your own as well. So we're going to do something to close. There's a bit of another kind of compassion practice that uses a different tool, uses something other than the kind of practices we've been working with today. But it's similar, I guess, in a way to compassion spark. It's something called appreciative inquiry. If you ever heard of this before, it's a way of asking questions that have a sort of positive lens built into them, that have a focus on highlights of our experience or positive exceptions to the rule. So often when we learn about and think about compassion, there's this kind of natural orientation of the mind, and in fact, you can study this with research, to go to the lack of compassion. Okay? To identify those experiences or those times when compassion is missing, or maybe we feel like that's the majority of the time, there's not enough compassion in society, and that's the sort of source of some of the issues that we're facing. But I invite you this time to just kind of see if you can put a pause on that kind of thinking about the lack of compassion. We're going to use appreciative inquiry to see if we can turn toward those rare moments, maybe rare moments, hopefully not rare, when there's the presence of compassion. And not just in a small way, but in a big way, an impactful way. So I'm going to share with you 3 questions. I invite you to begin to contemplate this on your own. And so if you want, this can remain just a personal contemplation and maybe a journaling activity. But we're also going to invite you to share in the breakout groups in Zoom and here in person, share with those around you if you're willing, small groups. So you can choose any of these 3 questions here. The first question is, what's a moment you can recall when self-compassion was truly alive for you? You can think about this in the context of a classroom, if you like, maybe a difficult situation, or in the workplace, difficult situation, or it could be in your life in general. When self-compassion was really alive for you. It can be big or small. And this is where appreciative inquiry is helpful, because it asks us to not just think about that in a broad way, but to get specific, okay? What led up to that experience of self-compassion? What was it that in that moment allowed you to uniquely tap into it? Why is that moment different than other moments? How did you remember self-compassion or to treat yourself with kindness in that moment? That's the leading up to. Then what was it like to actually extend that sense of kindness or care to yourself? What was different about that than maybe your habitual patterns of self-criticism, perfectionism, whatever it might be? And then, what was the result? Did it actually have the effect that you thought it would, to treat yourself with that care? So that's the first option. The second one, what's a moment you recall experiencing compassion for others? Okay, that was really strong for you. So the first one, self-compassion. Second question was about others. Again, big or small. Again, what led up to that experience? What made it different? What made it unique? Why was compassion especially strong for you in that situation? What was it like? And what was the result of that? Did it actually help? And then the third option is a bit different. It's more of a mental, intellectual thing, but it can also be an experiential thing. What's an aha moment for you, or an insight about compassion, self-compassion, or related ideas? So it could be something that happened in the context of what we're sharing today, or it could be that this happened in just life in general for you. It's kind of, I now understand this more. I understand how to care for myself better, or I understand how to care for others better. Okay, so one of those 3 things, self-compassion, compassion for others, or an aha moment. And if you're willing now to get into the breakout rooms, share with others, journal about that on your own, or turn to those nearby and share about this. Thank you, and that's always a little tricky. Who am I going to talk to? But yeah, you can also just reflect personally.
There's a group here too, if you, I don't know if you felt like joining or just wanted to be on your own, whatever you want. I can just see more people than you can, so.
Yeah. Stop at 2:10 to close with some words or anything. Just kind of.
Yeah, I think that's good. People like that, so let's see what they can like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't think of it. I thought for tonight.
Yeah, it's a workshop. Yeah. Right.
I think it's okay. I mean, this would have been nice, but I think I should be confident.
Yeah. I still got to spread them out.
You did.
Feel
I
excited about
totally forgot about them. He should have, I must have them too, right? To make it.
Probably, yeah.
Have you heard from him at all?
Well, actually, yeah. But then I respond to him and he doesn't reply back. So there's something. I mean, I know Lily said there was something. So.
He reached out at some point when it's been long. He had some website up or I don't know, I was doing something like this. Look, maybe a tea and then it was also, it was like suggested.
Yeah. He must have shifted gears, maybe.
But he's not working there anymore.
Yeah.
Have you heard from Lily or something?
Yeah. Seems like a good idea.
Yeah. Just thinking about that, so the beginning of our outward.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Do you want another piece?
No, actually, I still have mine because it's
Do
got
you
milk
do?
in it.
That's right. I know,
You're
I
welcome
would
to
have,
put this back in the bag. Nice.
I would have loved to get back. Chocolate. Oh, yeah. It's like, you're a chocolate person. I was like, yeah. Rice,
Oh, little crunch.
added ingredient we completely forgot about.
Did you?
Not really, New York City is a hard.
Right.
I went once, I remember. So I didn't live in an apartment building,
Yeah.
but I had a friend who had lived in an apartment building. And so we would go from floor to floor.
Yeah.
That was like massively interesting.
That is interesting. It seems like dangerous or something, but it's probably just my projection.
Well, I think if you know your apartment building, generally, you know, it's
Yeah.
neighbors, but obviously you can't go on the street because then.
Right. Right. Did they organize like neighborhood kind of like, yeah, I don't know, some kind of parade or something? Or?
We dressed up for school. That was the big excitement. But then that was it.
Just another minute, please.
But then when I was in college, I made up for it because I went to a small town around college.
Yeah.
So my
You were
it
able
was
to
like,
put a mask on and pretend.
she was like, "Come, let's go, but we'll go late after all the
Yeah.
kids have gone." And then people would just give us all of the rest of their kids. So I made up for all those years.
Did anybody call you out? For being
No,
too
they
old?
were all really,
Yeah.
they were happy because it was a college. They were,
Right.
and we didn't go when all the little kids were there, so they were all right.
Right. Yeah, I remember people doing things that were like they leave a bowl and it would say, please take one. And then they'd be underneath the table and then have a hole cut out in the bottom. And if you tried to take more than one, the hand would come up and grab you, teach
Really?
you a lesson.
That's,
Yeah, it's a good idea.
that's a good.
All right, thank you all.
Zoom people come back.
Yeah. I don't know if you'll be open to sharing with the bigger group, but sometimes it's nice. One or two people are willing to share something that came up for them as an example. Sometimes it's like, I don't really want to share it.
Yes, please share. And Thomas can maybe bring the microphone around. That way we can hear you.
No, nobody?
She has boundaries. Unbelievable.
That's self-compassion right there. That is.
Controversial.
You don't have to use the mic either.
I'll just share one. I'll share one. I think this is a way of me sharing also some of my own research or insights around this topic, which, yeah, I haven't yet shared that. So it was toward the beginning of lockdown, and I had just gone to the grocery store with my wife, and we were on the way back from the store in our neighborhood, and there was a homeless gentleman, maskless, standing on the opposite street corner, and we were about to cross the street. And I just felt, I was like, oh no, this person's going to approach us. I just felt that feeling. And he did, and he got, started walking fairly close to us. So we took a step back, and I turned and tried to make it look like we were just taking a step, not to get away from him, because I realized that would maybe upset him, but more just like to have a conversation on the side. But he was in fact offended by this and didn't understand why we were scared of him, and started yelling. And fortunately the light changed, and we got the walk signal, and so he started walking across us and screaming at us about being afraid of him and that there's no need to be afraid of him and so on. And in that moment, I just felt three things simultaneously, really. I felt compassion for him. I felt how challenging it must be not only to be homeless, but then to be homeless during this time, right, of lockdowns, and to have this experience sort of amplified of the suffering of that disconnection from others. Like, part of the reason that we were needing to step away is he was maskless, and we still didn't know much about the virus at that point. We really didn't want to get it, and still that way, really. But so that was all sort of amplifying what was his suffering in that moment. And then I felt compassion for us in that moment too, and just that we had tried our best to avoid this kind of situation and avoid kind of amplifying or contributing to the suffering, and yet nonetheless, it had caused this kind of discomfort, and we were being yelled at and screamed at. And the third thing I felt, though, was this interesting joining of those two. And I felt us as part of this bigger web of what was happening in this pandemic, of just this excess suffering or this additional layer of suffering that happens, just the way that COVID has worsened some things, not COVID itself, but the way it's changed those little moments, those situations. And I felt the possibility in that moment of feeling my self-compassion and my compassion for my wife together as one and the same experience with feeling compassion for that homeless man. It wasn't two separate things, my self-compassion and my compassion for the other. But there was actually this both and sort of feeling that arose that was able to hold me and him and society, actually. So that's even another layer of this, all together as one web, one feeling of care and concern. And so we can get sort of dualistic at times, right? It's kind of either or, like I'm either caring for myself or I'm caring for others. But the brilliant thing about compassion is actually it's a both and. It teaches us that in order to be effective, in order to help the most, it helps if we're in a resourced state. Empathy, the narrative around empathy is I must sacrifice my own well-being to be in this with you. Okay, that's part of that can be arise sometimes with empathy, right? But there's kind of self-sacrifice, like in order to help you, I have to feel the suffering too. But actually, compassion flips that and it says, no, I can help you better if I'm in a resourced state, if I'm feeling good myself. And that's actually going to lead more likely to lead to benefit over time. So I just wanted to share that as one closing thought here. It's now 2:15, so we'll go ahead and close this workshop too. I don't want to extend this out beyond. Any final thing you'd like to share?
Jordan, just want to say thank you, and it's been a joy to be with you, and thank you for your participation and presence and sharing, and hope this can be helpful to you personally and in all your work and your community, and blessings in this difficult time that we're really all in as a humanity. So yeah, thank you. Joy to be with you.
Yeah.
I feel my tension level decrease.
Oh,
The
good.
workshop.
That's how we want it to be, right? Good.
Which says it was needed.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Sometimes you just need that space too. Yeah.
Not with the instructor.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Take in
Right.
and not run around.
Yeah.
It's been a running around. Thank you so much. I was just saying to Jordan, I could feel my internal tensions and anxieties decrease during these 2 hours. So that was very
Well, that's
lovely.
good. A little recompense for all of your hard work.
Yeah, you know, it's just crazy. Like you said, trying to do my normal work in this.
I can't imagine.
So
There's
I
so
need
many
to
events.
slow down.
Yeah.
I'm glad you were a recipient of what you
Yes.
create. That's
Yes.
always good.
Yeah.
What is it? And Saturday? You still have some events through Saturday?
Tomorrow, well, tonight, and then tomorrow, we're doing, Tiffany's here, who's, from mental health clinician. She and one of the other people on our community, who's a clinical psychologist, are doing a training for therapists in the community on positive psychology.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, that'll be.
So you're leading
for-
that with Tiffany.
No, I'm not,
No.
I just organized it. We just got them
But
to do it,
Tiffany's-
but I'm gonna go, because
Yeah.
I need to see you, something I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So that'll wind it down, and then Tiff is in charge of the Out of the Darkness walk on Sunday, which is suicide.
Okay.
awareness. So
That's like the last event.
that's the last event. Yeah, yeah.
And that's a community walk.
It's a community walk to raise awareness, you know.
Hey, thanks.
That was
for-
awesome.
Yeah, thanks for
We're-
facilitating
usually,
this.
you know,
in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll be back this evening. Yeah.
Cool.
The breakout rooms, if we want to do them again, actually, were.
They did.
I don't
Good.
think I knew one person, and I was working